Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz Interview Series with jazz journeyman pianist and composer John Davis. Over the course of our conversation, he spoke about a career full of projects and action. In March of 2016, he is gearing up for a month in Russia and took some time to talk about his career. From learning piano from Lenny Tristano, who was a neighbor of his as a kid, to attending the New England Conservatory of Music briefly. And then he moved on to San Francisco in the 1980s, working with the great Jaco Pastorious. He was also a part of a venture with Melvins Nightfood, featuring the great Bob Weir from the Grateful Dead, and many other tasty tales that he recounts. He spoke about a wide range of topics, so get to know John and dig this interview, my friends.
Hey, thank you for taking some time to talk with me today.
Of course.
I'm going to go ahead and dive right in here, and I just kind of want a general snapshot from your own words. What has been going on with you lately?
Quite a bit, I guess. I just released, I guess you probably know, my third record for Positone, Changes Over Time, which is actually my seventh as a leader, starting the leader recording thing a little later in the grand scheme of things, but I'm doing that. That's doing well. About to go to Russia on Sunday for a month and do a trio tour there under my own name, which is exciting, kind of a first. So I'm dealing with visas and things like that. Keeping pretty busy running around New York, doing a lot of trio, duo, solo, other people's bands. Was at the Knickerbocker this last weekend, sort of the last of its kind, classic New York, although Mesro, a new club, is sort of a lot like that, which I've been playing at, the guy who owns Small Spike. So I'm just, keeping busy, writing and playing.
So gearing up to go to a place like Russia to deliver your music has to be a pretty exciting thing. I mean, do you like
daunting, exciting, nerve-wracking, all of the above, yes.
Yeah. So let me go back to the beginnings of your life here and get an idea. You grew up in New York. Talk to me about how you acquired this love of jazz and music.
Well, I guess pretty much ever since I can recall, I was gravitated towards the older kids who were playing music. And initially it was acoustic guitar. Actually, growing up on Long Island, late 60s, early 70s, bands like Acoustic Hot Tuna, Johnny Winter, Duane Allman, Leon Russell. Those are people that really captivated me. So I was really into acoustic guitar and finger picking. And then somewhere in those early years, I remember hearing jazz, usually coming out of some of the older kids. And there was a piano player that I used to hear at my high school, who's actually still active, quite active in L.A., Mitchell Foreman. He was a few years older. So I sort of got smitten with jazz, just started trying to get closer to that. Just before I left Long Island, I was very, very fortunate to take some lessons with Lenny Tristano, who is sort of a pretty unique figure in jazz, was a great eccentric blind piano sort of concept, and he happened to live near us on Long Island. So then I went to Boston and really got into it. But it was blues guitar and acoustic and James Taylor and the Beatles, and then it got to be jazz pretty intensely.
So in the early goes, you're doing the guitar and the piano. Why did you land on the piano?
Well, that's a good question. I still think I should have landed on the guitar, but I guess my mother nudged me towards piano because that's what you do if you're going to be serious. But I always loved the guitar, and I definitely loved the fact that you could bring it around with you and the physical closeness. Yeah, piano guitar is it's a whole topic in my psyche. In fact, I was living out in the Bay Area in California for the 80s, and I used to bring guitars to my gigs and practice the guitar in the back room after and say, I'm going to switch one of these days. Then I traded in one of my guitars when I got back to New York in 1990 for an electric bass, and ended up playing electric bass pretty seriously for quite a while, and that I really was gigging on. And I don't know if you're aware of my Jaco history, but a real highlight of life was working with Jaco out in the Bay Area for a couple of years, and without knowing it, I was sort of soaking up a fair amount of electric bass stuff. So electric bass became a real focus for quite a while. Yeah, it's one of those things. I don't know what would have happened if they didn't nudge me into piano. I always really loved guitar. I still do. I keep a pretty close eye on the guitar scene, but it's piano, like it or not.
Yeah. Well, I was going to get to Jaco later, but I do want to ask, when you're around someone that is like a genius on an instrument, do you kind of soak up that vibe by osmosis? Did you learn a lot from just watching him play?
All of the above, but I mean, so much it's hard to even begin to express. But among the most profound changes, I was in Europe with Jaco in 1985. It was a crazy tour. Jaco, was a pretty troubled soul, and he was in pretty questionable form a lot of the time. However, there was a lot of great stuff, and actually a lot of YouTubes of these phases. Who would have known that would ever happen? But there's a lot of duo and trio of YouTube of the stuff with Jaco in 1985 in Belgium and around. And my point was, prior to that whole experience, I always thought of myself as a kind of a jazz stylist, you know what I mean? It's just the repertoire's there, and you figure out how to personalize it, i.e., not a composer. And when I got back from Europe after Jaco, composition started sort of just pouring out. So I always thought he must have unleashed something, because ever since then I've been writing quite a bit of music. And he was very encouraging, because I remember I didn't see him for a while, and then I saw him, and we ended up recording one of my tunes, and he was very supportive about that. From an inspirational point of view, it was enormous. Then I learned a lot just from watching him play piano, because he really, every time he saw a piano, he sat down and played it, and he played all his compositions on piano, and he had enormous hands. And I have unusually large hands, particularly for my size, but I could actually benefit from watching the way he played. He sort of played the whole orchestra with his right hand and the bass with his left hand. He was something. And you'll forever, I think anybody that's around him will try to absorb some of the time feel, because the ultimate thing is the way his time, his groove was just, what could you say? He could have the whole room grooving in two measures on the piano. He just had a sense of time that it didn't matter whether it was drums, bass, or keyboards. So, I'm still, like you said, when you're around somebody like that, you'll probably process bits of it for the rest of your life. I mean, it seems now there are all these revivals of Jaco and the recent documentary and all this, so you revisit it, and I saw the documentary, and you start thinking all again about, he had this 12-tone tune where he was getting into contemporary classical music, and I recently just got the second part of that for the first time. So, he'll be it's like Bach or Coltrane or something. You think back on those moments forever, really.
Absolutely. Well, before we leave your early years, I want to kind of go back. When you got into jazz, was there a vinyl that you cracked open or an album that you listened to that just kind of parted some curtains for you for the jazz world?
Yeah, I don't know how I got to it, but right off the bat, there was a record by Herbie Hancock, Speak Like a Child. And although it's really one of the more, I don't know if I call it subtle, but sort of sophisticated, even amongst those Blue Note records, but it's Herbie just really stretching out. And so Speak Like a Child was just utterly captivating. And then I remember My Funny Valentine, Miles' record with that rhythm section with Herbie, Tony, and Ron, and the feel that they got, and on some of those tunes was, along with, I guess, Bill Evans, and actually, as it turns out, that first Jaco record, I did get that right off the bat, even though I was not a fusion guy at all, and I didn't pay that much attention to Weather Report, but Jaco's first record really really hit me. Portrait of Tracy I found mesmerizing, and I wouldn't think too much about him until 10 years later when I would actually meet him. But Herbie and Miles, with Herbie and Bill Evans, they were pretty strong right out of the get-go.
Yeah.
Keith Jarrett's solo, I guess that Keith Jarrett triple solo record was pretty mesmerizing. Bremen Lausanne, I think is the name of it.
So let me ask you this. When you were growing up, was it always music that was going to be your future, or did you have other dreams of what your life was going to turn out to be?
I liked art before music, just drawing. And I liked building stuff when I was a kid, motors and go-karts and hand stuff. By the time one was old enough to think about what it was they were going to do, I can't ever recall thinking that it was going to be something else, is the honest. I mean, I didn't play that seriously in high school. I mean, I didn't play in high school bands or any of that kind of stuff so much. So I was a little bit on the sidelines. I was more doing acoustic guitar jams and stuff. But I can never remember visualizing doing anything else for a living, actually. It was pretty clear by, I guess, 16 or 17 that I would figure out some way of doing that. That's all I can recall at the moment. I can never recall thinking, I mean, I had a pretty agile brain and I was good in school and stuff. And no, the idea of going and getting a degree or an occupation other than playing, no, I can never say that. That was never seemed to be an option.
So you move on to the New England Conservatory of Music.
Very briefly, for moments.
Okay, all right. So in a formal environment, you've been out in the world and you've played for years and years and years. What did you get from a formal environment learning about music?
Well, that's a good question and an interesting one. I didn't get much, because although I don't know, I forget what my mentality was when I put certain things down in resumes, but I guess I attended the New England Conservatory, but probably for about 6 months. And I wasn't ready for it. It wasn't ready for me. The school environment, it just wasn't what I was going to really do. Although I did get some lessons with Jackie Byard, and I did hear right off the bat a piano player which would become one of my heroes of all time when I was there, and that would be Fred Hirsch. And he was there at the time. So I guess one could say there would be some positives, but I left school, didn't go much, and then just figured it out really on-the-job training, so to speak. Practiced and got gigs. I sort of really believed in doing it. Singers, dancers, for humans. Playing music for people is the idea. Having said that, I wound up teaching at the New School in Mannes College here for about 8 or 9 years, as well as taking part in a lot of the IAJE, the jazz education conventions. Jazz education is really, since those years, has become it's by far the more likely way that people will wind up doing this. And what I've noticed really clearly, it might not even be as much for the musical aspects as the bonding social aspects. I mean, in that so many of the guys you see out there met in school and they formed these bonds, and they were already playing well, if not really well, but it's almost the social context. Yeah, I did not learn how to play in school, but I do see in the last bunch of generations that it seems, the vast majority of really great players are coming and they're sticking together. The New School guys, Larry Goldings and Kevin Hayes and Peter Bernstein and Bill Stewart, they all knew each other back then, and now the guys, the Strickland brothers and Mike Moreno and this whole Robert Glasper, they knew all each other there, and even the guys who were at New England when I was there, they're still all in bands together. So it's sort of like combines life and music. So you form these bonds, But as far as the actual nuts and bolts of learning, I guess there's a whole lot of learning going on in them. I was more into my little Marantz tape recorders and Wynton Kelly records and Herbie solos and Chick Corea solos and then getting gigs. So I've referred to myself as the last of the street generations, although, I have certainly a lot of friends that were in New England and Berkeley at that time. But I don't think too many musicians are learning outside of school these days. And the programs have gotten so much more and so much more comprehensive, and jazz camps. So players are really coming through a system, so to speak. In that sense, I daringly say it's become a lot like classical music. In certain regards, that's true. Although, that's a topic into itself. Classical jazz, So I school wasn't for me, and I taught at the New School for quite a while. And in fact, when a lot of the younger shining stars of the day were there, the Strickland brothers and Glasper was there, and Mike Moreno was there, and late 90s, early 2000s. The ones who need you are resistant, and then there's so many guys who are already at a high level there that what they really need to just do is play. And I don't know. I'm actually going to get back into some teaching this summer in Europe, in Austria. I'm using it as a new challenge, and I'm working with Don Sickler, this publisher, kind of a institution guy in New York, to get some teaching formats together. Yeah, it's an interesting topic, jazz education. It's the competitions. That's a whole new thing, the Monk competition and the launching pad. A lot of careers start in school, which I guess is part of it. You can see the bonding. I think John Coward and Brian Blade met each other in school, and it's these seeds are strong.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this: you grew up in Long Island, and you relocate to Frisco in the '80s. What made you?
Well, Boston was first, though. Boston was that was the first stopping. That's
okay.
6 years in Boston, and then San Francisco.
So what brought you to Frisco?
Well, I'd been in Boston for about 5 or 6 years. It was time to leave. Just felt time to leave. And it was kind of a funny time in jazz, which is an interesting historical topic, too. 1980, 81, jazz was kind of on a little dormant, or at least acoustic jazz, which I liked. It was Miles had retired, and Herbie and Chick were playing electric music, and it was on it was a little bit dormant. I didn't feel personally ready to go back, really to go to New York as a musician. I had two of my oldest friends were living in San Francisco, said, why don't you come out and visit? So I went out there and visited in early 1980 or 81, and it seemed really beautiful, and just kind of had this intuition that what I needed for my life. I'd pretty much been sitting in a little practice room in Boston, going practicing like a maniac for 5 or 6 years, and working quite a bit. But I guess I knew I needed a change, and the intensity of whatever New York seemed to require was a bit much for me. So I visited San Francisco, sort of fell in love with it, had two great old friends there. So I kind of packed up my van and I drove out to San Francisco. And that was 81, and it turned out to be a really good time for me to be there. It was sort of the end of an era. The early 80s in the Bay Area was the last of a really great time. And I ended up playing with a lot of great people out there. There was a stretch in the early mid-'80s where I'm playing with the young Larry Grenadier and Jeff Ballard, who are jazz royalty now with Brad Meldau and everybody else. So they were in high school. Got to play gigs with Joe Henderson, Johnny Coles, the great flugelhorn player, come off the road with Ray Charles. Eddie Henderson, Dr. Eddie Henderson was living out there. Larry Schneider, the great tenor player who had played with Bill Evans. So I could be a way bigger fish in a way smaller pond and have one hell of a life, so to speak. It was a nice time, early 80s Bay Area.
Yeah, right on. So you've been involved in projects, obviously, with Jaco and others. Brian Melvins Nightfood.
Brian, yeah, I can't forget Brian, that's right.
And then that was with Bob Weir. What was that experience like?
Well, all right. So yeah, I somehow I forgot Brian. So Brian became a main character, and he's in the Bay Area, or was, and he was one of these guys that really just imagine things and make them happen in a kind of an unbelievable way.
Yeah.
And he was onto something early, this acid jazzy thing, before it really took off, combining all these sort of styles and this and that. And Brian has always had an amazing quality for being able to connect with anyone that he sees, worthwhile for whatever reason. I mean, anybody.
Yeah.
And he always had a connection with the Grateful Dead from his teenage years, I guess, because he was just, that part of town, and I don't know, the Hells Angels, and there was a little bit of mystery going on there. I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but I know we spent a whole lot of time up at Bob Weir's place in San Rafael doing these recordings, and then we used to hang out with Santana and Joe Henderson and Jaco, and Brian used to just figure out how to get them all in the same place, and it seems kind of unbelievable. I mean, it seemed unbelievable then, but it seems even more unbelievable now. So yeah, Bob we got to stretch quite a bit with. Bob Weir. Santana wasn't playing with us, but we were hanging out with him and such. And Jaco, I think there were gigs actually with Jaco, Joe Henderson, and Bob Weir. Only Brian Melvin could make that happen.
Uh-huh.
That is for sure.
That's awesome.
Yeah, Brian, he's been doing that his whole life. He's good at connecting people from different walks of life. There's been a lot of that his whole life. And yeah, he was a deadhead growing up, and so he had this fantasy of having Jaco and Bob Weir in the same thing, and he made it happen.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I can't imagine how, although he just used to make shit happen, and he's always been pretty natural at that.
Man, God bless the dreamers, huh?
Yeah, you got that right. There's never been a gap between fantasy and why not.
Yeah.
I mean, he's got a special quality that way. I mean, we haven't been in such close touch in recent years, but he did the same thing with Beatle Jazz subsequently, who I ended up subbing for Dave Kukowski and doing a couple Beatle Jazz tours with Brian. We went to Korea and India, and he's a dreamer that makes him happen.
That's wonderful, man. So you leave Frisco and come back to New York in the early 90s. What prompted that move back to the coast, the East Coast?
Well, it was once again time to make a change. I kind of always knew in the back of my mind that New York is when all's said and done, where jazz history is and where new jazz history is happening, and it's home. I was always a little hyper and a little wiry and a little too energized for the Bay Area or something like that. I mean, it was a little sleepy, even though it's beautiful.
Yeah.
But I'm a New Yorker, there's no doubt, and it was just time. So I came back, about 90, although we had been going back and forth to Europe for about a year or two with Brian and a couple other guys. But, formally came back here at about 90. And, been through a lot of lifetimes in New York already again.
And then at that time you come back, and it said that you became the house pianist at for the jam sessions at the Blue Note. All kinds of stuff was going on. How did you feel about getting all that experience at Frisco and coming back home? What was that like for you?
I mean, it's clear out there is definitely where I really learned what I was doing. So, it quote unquote prepares you in a certain regard. But having said that, New York still is is mind-boggling in terms of the intensity and the amount of players at every age, at every level. So while you're certainly prepared, you know, and I did a lot of gigs in San Francisco where, yeah, any tune, any key, any tempo, go ahead, whatever. Try to surprise me. I mean, I got a lot of that at the end of Boston, too. I had some older guys who sort of put me through the mill, and, you know, and I remember realizing, all right, these guys were hard, but they were helping. And so you get back to New York and you realize, all right, you know, that was a whole lot of good stuff, but at the same time, the amount of players in New York and just the intensity and the amount of guys coming here constantly is still, you know, it's still shocking. It's shocking now, you know, go down the block to Smalls every day and who's that? Who's that? Where'd they come from? It never stops. So, you know, you're ready, but I guess the big difference is San Francisco, you can be a known entity, and New York, it's like, you know, it's not quite as easy to stand out in New York, although everybody would tell you that. So you know, you need to hold your own. You're not going to get nobody's holding your hand and patting you on the back in New York in kind of the same way. So you had to readjust a little bit.
Yeah,
it's an intense scene. I mean,
yeah.
I've been working nonstop here now for all those years, but it's still there's no coasting. I don't think at any level. I don't think Kenny Barron would tell you he got to a place where he could coast in New York. I don't know. It seems that way. It's still New York. Absolutely. Although internet has changed the playing field dramatically, the amount of guys in a 20 block radius of where I'm sitting right now is still sort of a staggering reality. So that's, you know, Blue Note was great. Got to play for Herbie Hancock and meet a lot of good guys, but that was a long time ago. Wow.
Well, and let me branch out of here. We've talked about all these projects. You've been all over the world, South Korea, India, Switzerland, Europe. You're going to Russia. What story on the road sticks out in your mind? A good on-the-road story that happened with you that just kind of surfaces and you just kind of, you remember it?
Well, lately I've been remembering some with Jaco since I just saw that Jaco video. So yeah. I'm not sure if that's a fair way to answer this question because those are so particular, but some of those Jaco later years are starting to bother me how they're represented in recent books and in these documentaries because I was around them during those later years. So there are a few pretty classic road stories.
Yeah, and I didn't want to get kind of, because I know Jaco's really in the consciousness of people now with this documentary, and it's received a lot of awards, and I didn't want to kind of get off on that, but I think maybe that's a question that I have for you, is that historically, you know, after John Lennon died, everybody had these suppositions of, you know, what he was really all about. Some of them were ugly, but you get in a situation where ABC did that documentary with the Beatles, and you didn't hear anything other than it was magic when they got together, and John was John. And I think that when you get this legendary kind of cult status from these figures that leave early, like Cobain and Lennon and all these guys, all of this unbelievable rancor starts coming up about him. And that has to, since you were right next to him, why do you think that phenomenon happens? Do they have to have that to sell the brand, or is it people that didn't like him, or what do you think it is?
It's you know, I was letting it brush off for a long time, and I kind of avoided seeing this documentary on Jaco until very recently. Somebody sent it to me and said, "All right, it's time," and all of a sudden, it's starting to really, I don't know if annoy me, it frustrate me in that regard. And Bill Mulkowski, who wrote that book, and I know Bill a little bit, I need to go look at that book again or read it again because it still seems to me like people have really focused on, the really treacherous, dreary, unfortunate element of especially those last 3 or 4 years. That's probably a question bigger than music. I mean, look at
right.
our elections right now, which we certainly will not talk about. But
no.
People are a conflicted thing by nature, and turmoil is intriguing. I know it's like rubbernecking on the highway. I don't know, why would anybody want to see a person that just got smashed up? But I find it. In fact, when I get back from Russia, I was actually thinking about getting in touch with Bill Mulkowski and saying, the world wants to know about these people. Jaco had 35 years, 15 of them as a professional, 3 of them is a lot. That's a big portion of it, and people just write it off as he was a derelict wearing women's clothes in a basketball court in New York, and that may be very well true, but there were a lot of really, compassionate, charming, giving elements during those years as well that really have not been documented, if at all. So in regards to him specifically, at some point it might be nice to have that documented, chime in a little bit, because there were some really pretty touching stories that I witnessed, as well as, listen, this stuff's not being made up. These stories aren't being fabricated in Jaco's case. He was asking for trouble, and he was a tortured, troubled soul. There is no getting around that. It was certainly never black and white, probably not in his early years either, and not in the later years.
Let me ask you a question. You performed with what the world would consider jazz heroes: Phil Woods, Frank West, Stan Getz, Victor Lewis, Bob Minster. The list goes on. But in your world, who were your jazz heroes?
The big 4 of modern piano players, which is a phrase that I've used for years now, is hard to ever see how that happens again. At least 4 at a time, which would be Herbie, Chick, Keith Jarrett, McCoy Tyner. To have these 4 guys, which also I think it's constantly underappreciated. They're still all alive, which is astounding, because the generation following them, which I guess would be loosely my own, give or take 5 or 10 years here, has not fared nearly as well. What I mean by that is Mulgrew Miller, James Williams, Kenny Kirkland. Those guys all checked out real early. So you've got these titans that seem to be, defying time, although McCoy is not doing great. But so Herbie, Chick, Keith, and McCoy are the undeniable powerhouses of modern being relative. Now that's evolved, but certainly when I was getting into jazz, as well as Bill Evans being their daddy, and guys like Wynton Kelly and Red Garland, and I like the stride guys as well, Earl Hines, and Tatum is sort of the comprehensive master. I liked guitar a lot. I think I mentioned, I was a big fan of Mike Stern, and I got to play a fair amount with him a few years ago and do a guy's record with him, which was a real treat, because he's always sort of been a hero. So the piano players, and then there was a guy who I think I also just mentioned who remains an amazing inspiration, who I heard right off the bat, and that's Fred Hirsch. And I think he's been very appreciated by the subsequent generations, guys like Brad Meldau and the guys that follow. I think piano, not so much the broadness of jazz, but specifically piano, tendencies have been expanded, and I think it really started with Fred in terms of a classical approach when you're playing ensemble, as far as each hand and voice leading and counterpoint and stuff. So Fred's always had a huge effect. And I've always liked listening to the younger guys too. So certain horn players, Brecker and Larry Schneider and Wayne Shorter and Train, of course, and Lenny Tristano had you getting to guys like Lester Young, and
yeah, that's a good list for sure.
There's a lot of guys. And I still always have been into the guys that I grew up in. I put on acoustic hot tuna the other day for a friend of mine who had no idea who they were, and it sounded as great as it ever did.
Yeah.
I can't believe how Yorma and Jack Cassidy used to play. I mean, that was good stuff. Yeah, I still. I mean, one of my conscious tendencies is to always want to try to include everything I've liked in the jazz, whether it's, Roberta Flack and Leon Russell and Carole King and, although that sort of sentiment, I don't want my music to just sound like a 60s Blue Note, even though those guys might have been so impressionable. But the idea is to sort of let everything leak in a little bit.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this. A man that has dedicated his life to jazz, very simple question, why do you love jazz?
Well, I mean, you can you can sort of just speculate. I mean, why do you love chocolate? I don't know. It tastes good.
Yeah.
I started hearing jazz. I can sort of remember the moments where I was. I remember in 8th grade being at a junior high friend, and somebody's brother had Red Garland and Coltrane on it. And I'm just like, what is that? Are you kidding me? Listen to this stuff. And I remember hearing this guy, Mitchell Foreman, who was in high school 3 years older than me, playing like Bill Evans. I was probably in 8th grade. He was probably in 10th or 11th grade. And I used to go home and tell my mother, is this kid doing something? I mean, I can't believe it. The Doors, I used to light my fire in some of that stuff. I remember hearing Van Morrison, Moondance, and I liked the way that solo sounded. There was something, I guess, it boils down to present tense. I guess jazz combines, the ultimate goal of jazz is to work within a structure that exists, like in any language, whether it's English or music, get your own personality into it, and so you personalize within a structure. And then with jazz, the true beauty is it's truly spontaneous. And every time you sit down and do it, either by yourself, piano sort of has that luxury a little bit easier than most instruments, but particularly with other people. I did a trio gig at Smalls 2 nights ago. It was a record CD release, and the drummer, I played one gig with him with somebody else about 2 years ago, somebody else's music. I had all original music. He never saw it. He never listened to it. On stage, as I'm counting it off for the audience, is when he's singing the tunes for the first time. And I told him before the gig, don't hold back. Don't be indulgent. Just whatever you're feeling. And so all night long, on stage for the first time on relatively new music, he'd never see it. I'm responding in a completely, new, spontaneous way because he's doing accents and doing things. He never played this stuff before. So for jazz musicians, I mean, most people outside of the realm, people that are there, I say, oh, yes, this is the first gig we ever played together. Ugana, the bass player, and him had never met each other. So here we're playing for a packed house at a CD party. Now, that's not that unusual for jazz.
Right.
I mean, looking back, I might have appreciated one rehearsal in all fairness, but it's certainly not unusual. And I'm about to go to Russia, and we have no idea what we're going to play. I mean, we haven't even talked about it. I get there the 21st. There's a concert the 22nd. So the idea of jazz, I don't know if there's another practice quite like that, where guys at a high level have an interactive craft, so that you can actually go do something without any communication and share it like that. So I guess whatever feelings that triggers has always seemed what makes sense for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you this. Everybody around you has a version of who you are as a person. Your family, your fans, your business associates. But you, who do you think you are?
Well, that's tricky. I guess I tend to think I embody a lot of those same qualities as what I was explaining about jazz. I consider myself really pretty present tense. I mean, there are tangents going on in my mind as I'm sort of doing everything. So I'm sort of having counterpoint go on in my brain and my life and my existence as it's happening. Somewhat dramatic, little hyper. Try to keep the humor going in life. Humor is a pretty crucial element. pretty narrow-minded, in all fairness. There's not too many things I'm concerned about. Probably bizarrely narrow-minded, people would think, but it just seems, I don't know, a narrow focus seems to be what is how I can handle things. I'm more concerned about being, saturated with a small amount of stuff, people and pursuits than touching upon a whole lot of things. So I'm pretty focused, pretty disciplined, I guess. I guess that can make one seem a little selfish. So that I don't think selfish is a bad word particularly. I think it is more of it's a statistical word. If you don't have kids, which I don't consciously, and you don't, you spend a lot of time. I mean, artists are probably fairly selfish by nature because, I'm still a hard practicer, harder than ever. I can't wait to get back to work, every day, there's stuff you got to do, but still playing and getting closer. I'm pretty hard working at this pursuit, but it doesn't really feel like work, so obsessed, I guess is a better word.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. This is my final question for you. You are far from done, and I want to ask you this, though. When the world peels back the annals of jazz history, you have been steeped in it for a long time. When they come across your name, that finger goes down that page and finds your name. What do you want the world to remember your contribution to the world of jazz for?
Well, again, that's in my case, that's an interesting question because as I've started to embark upon becoming a leader, which I've done later in life, much later after avoiding it. So just the last 6 or 7 years, I'm getting music out under my own name. I do have this footnote, which I am more than appreciative of the Jaco thing. But what I would really like to do is get enough out there in the next few years where it stands on its own. Oh yeah, this guy, man, he played with Jaco. You ever see those clips? That's good. I'm glad that exists. But I would like to get to the point where there's enough composition and strength in style that people might say, oh, this guy was in the mix of guys of that generation. He's got his own take on, I hear it. I know he liked Duane Allman and Johnny Winter and the Beatles and Carole King and McCoy Tyner and Stevie Wonder all at the same time, so leave some music and compositions behind that people feel are worth listening to.
Right on. That's perfect. That's a perfect way to kind of wrap everything up. John, hey, thank you for being so inviting and open and giving me your story. I really appreciate your time today.
It's been absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the globe, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to John for his warmth, his music, and his tales. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store or visit theneonjazz.blogspot.com for all things Neon Jazz. Until next time, enjoy the music, my friends.
Neon Jazz.